There are moments in life that feel small when they happen. A comment at dinner, a look that lasts too long, a silence that says too much. But later, you realized they were the fracture before the break. For me, that moment happened the night before my 29th birthday. Maia Hernandez had always been the responsible one, the one who worked quietly, saved carefully, and carried the weight of a family that never once thanked her for it. Her younger sister, Bella, was the opposite, reckless, charming, and adored. Where Maia was practical, Bella was radiant. Her parents, Emilio and Rosa, made no secret of which daughter brought them pride. For years, Maia told herself it didn't matter, that being overlooked was easier than being depended on. But as I tell you this story, I can promise, there's only so long someone can be invisible before they finally decide to make everyone see. It had started with small things, Maia covering Bella's utilities just for 1 month, helping with a car payment until she gets back on her feet. Then rent. 40 months of it in total, over $34,000. Money Maia could have used to build a life, to travel, to breathe. But Bella always had an excuse, and their parents always had praise. Every dinner family felt like an award ceremony for the golden child. Bella's doing so well, her mother would beam. She's responsible, hardworking, independent. And Maia, always sitting at the end of the table, would smile and nod, never mentioning that Bella's independence came from Maia's quiet sacrifices. The night before Maia's birthday, she sat alone in her apartment, scrolling absently through Facebook. It was late, and her phone buzzed with a reminder for her rent payment, Bella's rent payment, due the next morning. Her fingers hovered over the payment button, but something in her chest felt heavy. Reluctant. That's when she saw it. A post from her mother. A brightly lit living room, balloons, streamers, a banner that said, "Surprise! Congratulations, Bella!" And there, in Bella's hands, was a brand new silver laptop, the exact model Maia had been saving for months, just out of reach because she kept choosing responsibility over reward. The caption beneath the photo read, "So proud of our responsible girl. You deserve everything good in life." Maia stared at it until her vision blurred. She looked at her reflection in the dark screen, her own tired face staring back. Responsible. The word echoed in her head like a cruel joke. Responsible enough to sacrifice, but never enough to be seen. When she opened her phone again, another notification appeared. A group text from her family. Her mother's message read, "Tomorrow, let's just focus on celebrating Bella. Maia doesn't mind. She's always been the understanding one." That was the moment something inside her cracked. Not loudly, not with fury, just a quiet final snap, like a thread pulled too tight for too long. She sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the hum of her refrigerator, the faint sound of cars outside. Then calmly, she opened her laptop and began to type. 3 emails. That's how it began. 3 emails that would change everything. The first went to her landlord. She explained she'd be moving out at the end of the month. No forwarding address. No explanation. The second went to her employer. Her notice of resignation. She'd been at that job for 7 years, loyal to the point of invisibility, watching others rise while she stayed in the same spot. Her boss would be shocked. He never imagined Maia would walk away. And the third, the one that mattered most, went to her bank. She requested the cancellation of the recurring payment linked to Bella's rent, effective immediately. When she hit send, she didn't feel guilt, she felt light. That night, she started packing. Just small things at first. Clothes, documents, the photo albums she'd bought but never filled. As she boxed up her life, her mind drifted between exhaustion and clarity. The world had always told her to be patient, to give, to understand. But patience without respect is just permission to be used. and understanding without reciprocity is a cage. For the first time in her life, Maia wasn't waiting to be appreciated. She was leaving. Morning came quietly. Sunlight crept through the blinds, falling across half-packed boxes and an open suitcase. Maia's phone buzzed again, another text from her mother. "Don't forget to come tonight. We're celebrating Bella's promotion. You can blow out your candles with her." A shared birthday, a shared spotlight, a shared invisibility. Maia smiled faintly, turned her phone off, and slipped it into a drawer. By evening, she dropped off her apartment keys, her resignation letter, and a final envelope addressed to her parents. Inside was a simple note. "Please tell Bella she'll need to cover her own rent from now on. Love, Maia." Then she got into her car and drove. No destination in mind, only the open road ahead. As city lights faded in her rearview mirror, she felt the weight of decades lifting off her shoulders. Behind her, her family would be gathering, lighting candles, clinking glasses, laughing without her. But in that moment, Maia didn't care. For the first time in years, she wasn't the quiet, dependable daughter. She wasn't the invisible sister. She was someone new, someone untethered. Still, she had no idea that her quiet act of defiance would ripple further than she ever imagined. That within days, the facade her family had built, the golden child illusion, would start to crumble. And when it did, the truth wouldn't just hurt, it would burn. As she crossed the state line that night, Maia glanced in her mirror one last time, not at what she was leaving, but at who she'd been forced to be. Then she looked forward again, her headlights cutting through the darkness. Her new life hadn't begun yet, but the revenge, the kind built not on spite, but on freedom, had already started. And it all began with 3 emails. When you remove yourself from a cycle of control, the world doesn't end quietly. It groans, resists, tries to pull you back in. Maia learned this 3 days after she left. By then, she had driven 6 hours south, ending up in a small coastal town she'd only seen once in a brochure. The air smelled like salt and freedom. She found a modest rental above a cafe that overlooked the ocean, a space that felt too empty but also perfectly hers. For the first time in her adult life, she woke up without an alarm, without an obligation, without a single message demanding her time or her money. But peace doesn't come without noise. Her phone, tucked away in her glove compartment, was already flooded. When she finally turned it on, it vibrated nonstop, dozens of missed calls, voicemails, and texts. The first few were predictable. Her mother demanding to know why the rent transfer had failed. Her father trying to sound calm but edged with irritation. Then Bella's messages, panicked, then furious. The tone of their words changed as hours passed, from "you must have forgotten the payment" to "what kind of person does this to her own sister?" Maia scrolled through them without emotion. The same entitlement she'd fed for years was now screaming in desperation. Then came the voicemail from her mother, the one that made her pause. Her mother's voice, trembling with anger, said, "You embarrassed us, Maia. Bella had to borrow money from your uncle just to pay her landlord. You can't just disappear like this. We expected better from you." Expected better. The phrase stabbed deeper than the rest. Not worried about you, not "are you safe?" Just disappointment that the gears of their comfort machine had stopped turning. That night, Maia sat on her small balcony, the ocean whispering below, and thought about how easy it had been for her family to rewrite her story. In their minds, she wasn't the daughter who had sacrificed. She was the selfish one now, the difficult one, the problem. But that was the thing about being the dependable one for too long. When you finally stop, people confuse your boundaries for betrayal. Days turned into a week. The messages slowed but didn't stop. Her father's tone softened, her mother's turned guilt-ridden. They said they just wanted to understand. Then came Bella's final text. "You're ruining my life. I hope you're happy." Maia didn't reply. She didn't owe anyone an explanation. Not anymore.
Instead, she focused on building small routines. Morning walks, cheap coffee from the cafe downstairs, reading books she'd never had time for. She got a temporary job at a local bookstore, something simple, quiet, with no pressure. But peace has a way of stirring ghosts. One evening, while sorting through old boxes, she came across a folder. Years of bank statements, receipts, and rent transfers, every one of them marked with Bella's name. She realized she had been documenting her own erasure, month after month, in neat digital transactions. A thought began to form, not out of malice, but out of justice. For so long, her family had painted Bella as the independent success story, but Maia had proof of the truth. She hadn't intended to expose them, not at first, but when she opened Facebook again out of habit, she saw another post, a family photo from the night of the shared birthday. There they were, her parents, her sister, candles, cake, laughter. The caption read, "So blessed to celebrate our responsible girl. Bella's hard work pays off again. Promotion, new laptop, and now saving for her own place." Saving. Maia stared at that word until her eyes stung. That was the spark that turned quiet freedom into deliberate action. She didn't want revenge in the traditional sense. She didn't want to hurt them, but she did want the truth, her truth, to live somewhere other than her head. She began compiling documents, rent transfers, messages from Bella asking for help, the note her mother had sent saying, "Can you cover Bella again this month? You know she's trying her best." Piece by piece, she built a digital record of 40 months of sacrifice. Then she wrote, not to her family, not to accuse or beg or justify, but to tell her story exactly as it had happened. She posted it anonymously on a popular forum for personal stories, a place where people went to share unfairness, betrayal, recovery. She titled it, "I paid my sister's rent for 40 months while my parents called her independent. I finally stopped." It wasn't cruel. It wasn't vengeful. It was factual, honest, human. The post exploded overnight. Thousands of comments poured in. Strangers called her brave. Some said they had lived the same story. Others urged her to cut contact entirely. For the first time in her life, Maia felt seen, not as a background character, but as someone whose pain had value. A few days later, she got an unexpected message in her inbox. Someone had connected the dots. The family photos, the names, the town. The story had leaked into her parents' social circle. By the following week, her family's perfect image began to unravel. Bella's workers whispered. Friends unfollowed. Their parents' pride, built on illusion, began to crack under public scrutiny. Her mother called again, voice shaking. She said, "How could you humiliate us like this?" But Maia didn't answer. She didn't have to, because this wasn't humiliation, it was exposure. The truth finally seeing daylight after years of shadows. She turned her phone off again and went for a walk by the shore, the wind tangling her hair. The ocean moved endlessly forward, uncaring of the noise behind her. For the first time in nearly a decade, Maia didn't feel small. She didn't feel invisible. She felt real. Still, she knew the storm was only beginning, because when people who thrive on control lose it, they don't surrender quietly. The next call wouldn't be from her mother. It would be from someone she least expected, and that call would set the final part of her story in motion. As the waves crashed below her balcony that night, Maia felt a strange calm settle over her. Whatever came next, she was ready. Because this time, she wasn't defending herself. She was simply standing in her truth. And sometimes, that's the most powerful revenge of all.
There's a strange kind of silence that follows truth. It isn't peaceful. It's charged, waiting, like the air before a storm. That's what Maia felt in the days after her story went viral.
At first, she thought the noise had passed. She'd stopped checking her messages, turned off notifications, tried to focus on her small, calm routines. But the internet had a way of echoing back louder than expected. The post, her story, was no longer just hers. It had been shared on forums, podcasts, and even a few story channels. People debated about her family. Some sympathized with her, others speculated, and a few guessed details correctly. Within a week, her parents' friends began calling them, asking questions they didn't know how to answer. It didn't take long for her parents to realize what had happened. They had built their reputation on Bella's image, the perfect daughter, responsible and talented, supported by a loving family. But the truth had split that image down the middle. And once an illusion cracks, people start to see everything they'd missed before. The first person to reach out wasn't her mother or father, but Bella. Maia received the message late one evening after closing the bookstore. It wasn't angry this time. It was pleading. Bella said she was being harassed online, that people had figured out her identity. She begged Maia to take the post down. Maia read the message twice. The guilt was still there, buried deep beneath layers of exhaustion and betrayal. But she knew. The truth wasn't what ruined Bella's reputation. Her behavior did. Still, she didn't respond. That night she sat on her balcony again, the wind colder than before. She thought of all the years she'd spent trying to keep peace, the countless times she'd bitten her tongue to avoid conflict. And now, silence had turned into power. But the story didn't stop there. 2 days later, Maia received an email from someone unexpected, her father. The subject line read, "Let's talk." He wasn't angry. He was measured, almost cautious. He said he understood why she'd done what she did. He even admitted he hadn't realized how much she'd sacrificed. But then his words shifted. He said her mother was devastated, that Bella's mental health was fragile, and that the family needed to rebuild their image. Rebuild their image. The word stung. Her father wasn't asking her to heal. He was asking her to help them save face. He ended the email with a suggestion that Maia post a follow-up saying she'd exaggerated and that things were now resolved privately. He said it would help everyone move on. For a long time, Maia just stared at the screen. Her whole life, her family had used her sense of duty against her. And here they were, trying again. Not an apology, not accountability, just a request for silence dressed as reconciliation. She closed the email without replying. Instead, she went to the cafe below her apartment and ordered a coffee she couldn't quite finish. The barista, a quiet older woman named Noreen, noticed her mood. She said, "You look like you just made a hard choice." Maia smiled faintly. Maybe I finally didn't make one. The next few weeks were both freeing and lonely. Maia's family stopped reaching out as often, but the distance left an ache she couldn't ignore. She missed the idea of family, the comfort she'd always chased, even if it had never been real. But sometimes letting go of a toxic bond doesn't feel like victory. It feels like grief. Then, unexpectedly, the phone rang again. A number she hadn't saved but recognized instantly. Her Uncle Miguel. He had always been different, quieter, more grounded. As children, he'd been the only adult who saw through the favoritism, who slipped Maia's small kindnesses when her parents ignored her. When she answered, his voice was heavy. He said he'd read the post and wanted to tell her something she deserved to know. It turned out that years ago, her parents had taken out a small family loan, money intended for both daughters' education. But instead of splitting it, they'd given nearly all of it to Bella, claiming Maia was too responsible and would manage without it. They had quietly used Maia's savings to cover some of those repayments later on, without ever telling her. Maia sat in stunned silence as he spoke. Her sacrifices hadn't just been unappreciated, they had been expected. built into the family's financial decisions like an invisible tax on her reliability. That night, the final layer of illusion peeled away. Her parents hadn't simply been blind to her effort. They had profited from it. The realization didn't make her angry. It made her clear. For the first time, Maia understood that she hadn't lost a family. She'd lost a facade. And there's no mourning a lie once you've seen it for what it is. She opened her laptop again, but not to write another public post. Instead, she began to plan her future. Quietly, deliberately, she applied for positions in the coastal town. She contacted an accountant to separate her finances completely from her family. She even began outlining an idea for a small business, something she'd always dreamed about, but never dared to pursue while she was too busy funding someone else's life. Still, she knew this wouldn't be the end. Families like hers didn't accept being cut off. They regrouped, re-strategized, and she was right. A few weeks later, her parents showed up in person. They arrived at her apartment unannounced, faces tight with concern and pride. They brought gifts, flowers, pastries, hollow peace offerings. But beneath the politeness, she could feel the manipulation humming like a familiar song. They said they wanted to start fresh, that they were willing to forgive. But what they meant was clear. They wanted her silence. Maia listened quietly, nodding, letting them believe she was considering it. But inside, she was already making her next decision, one that would finally close the chapter on their control, for good. The next move wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be cruel. It would be surgical, precise, final. And when it was done, her family's version of the story would never recover.
There's a calm that comes before you decide to end something, not out of anger, but out of absolute certainty. For Maia, that calm arrived the morning after her parents' visit. They had left her apartment spotless and quiet, but their presence lingered like a heavy perfume, artificial, cloying, impossible to ignore. She could still hear her mother's practice words echoing through the room. "We just want the family to heal. You've made your point, Mija." Her point, as if everything she had endured, decades of invisibility, financial strain, emotional manipulation, could be summarized as a point. When they left, they had smiled too widely, hugged too tightly. Her father slipped an envelope into her hand. "Just a small gesture," he said. Inside was a check, $5,000, meant to buy her silence, disguised as help. That check sat on her kitchen table all night. She couldn't decide whether to laugh or cry. It was the same amount she'd once sent Bella in a single desperate month to help her get back on her feet. By morning, Maia knew exactly what she would do. She didn't want revenge in the way movies showed it, fire and chaos and shouting matches. She wanted exposure, quiet, undeniable, permanent. She started with paperwork. Over the next few days, she compiled everything. The bank records, the years of transactions, her parents' emails, even the message from her uncle confirming the family loan. Every receipt, every transfer, proof of a lifetime of exploitation wrapped neatly in digital trails. Then she contacted a financial consultant, explaining that she suspected her identity and funds had been used without her consent. She didn't mention family. She just said, "someone close." The consultant was meticulous. He confirmed what her uncle had said. Her parents had used her information years ago to co-sign a line of credit tied to Bella's tuition fund. It had quietly drained interest from her savings for nearly a decade. Maia didn't get angry. Not anymore. She just filed the paperwork, identity correction forms, financial disputes, legal notices. It was all routine, detached, procedural, but it was also justice, inch by inch. The fallout began quietly. 2 weeks later, her parents received official letters from the bank, followed by calls from their accountant. Their carefully constructed financial facade began to crack. Bella's credit history, tied to that same account, was flagged. Suddenly, the house of cards they'd built from Maia's stability started to collapse. They didn't call her immediately. Pride kept them silent at first. But when they did, the tone had shifted. No more guilt trips, no more condescension. Just panic. Her mother left voicemail after voicemail, alternating between crying and begging. "You don't understand what you've done to this family. We could lose everything." She listened to each one, her face unreadable. She wasn't proud. She wasn't vengeful. She was simply done carrying consequences that weren't hers. Then came Bella's turn. The call came late one evening. Bella's voice was hoarse, the confident lilt gone. She said she couldn't get approved for a new apartment lease because of the flagged account. She said people at work treated her differently now, that they knew the truth. Maia didn't respond, not because she didn't care, but because there was nothing left to say. In the quiet that followed, she realized something profound. The revenge she had imagined wasn't really revenge at all. It was a rebalancing. For years, her family had rewritten the story to favor one daughter. Now, the scales had simply evened out. But life, as it always does, kept moving. Her job at the bookstore turned into a full-time position. The owner, a kind man named Elias, noticed her organization skills and asked if she'd consider helping him manage the place. It wasn't glamorous, but it was peaceful, and it was hers. She began to fill her apartment with small, personal things: plants, books, local art. Pieces of a life she was finally choosing for herself. One afternoon, as she was shelving books, her phone buzzed again. Not from family, but from an unknown number. The message was brief. "I'm proud of you, Uncle Miguel." She smiled for the first time in weeks. Still, the peace didn't come without one final ripple. A few days later, she received a letter, not an email, but an envelope with her father's handwriting. Inside was a single page. No excuses, no manipulations, just a sentence that read, "Your mother and I didn't know how to love you without needing you." It wasn't an apology, it wasn't forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement, and sometimes that's enough to close a wound. Maia didn't reply. She folded the letter neatly and placed it in a small wooden box with the rest of her old family keepsakes. She didn't want to destroy it. She just wanted to keep it where it couldn't hurt her anymore. Months passed. The story online faded from the public eye, as all viral tales eventually do. But for Maia, it didn't fade. It transformed. She started journaling again, not about pain, but about freedom. She began volunteering at a local shelter, helping women who had been financially manipulated by family or partners. For the first time, her empathy wasn't being used against her. It was being used to help others rebuild. Then, on a quiet morning in spring, she received a message that surprised her. "Bella." It wasn't long or defensive or bitter. It just said, "I've finally got my own place. I'm paying my own bills. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to know I'm trying." Maia sat in silence for a long time after reading it. Then, without overthinking, she replied with one word: "Good." And that was it. No reconciliation, no apologies owed or given. Just a quiet end to a long, painful chapter. But even as peace settled, Maia couldn't help but think, her parents still hadn't truly faced what they'd done. They'd lost their financial hold, their social image, but they hadn't lost their pride. And she knew them well enough to understand that pride was a stubborn dang. It wouldn't fade quietly. Something was coming, the last attempt to pull her back into their orbit. Only this time, Maia would be ready. Because she was no longer the invisible one. She was the storm they created. And now,
She was learning how to live in its calm.
The past has a way of circling back, not because it wants to be remembered, but because it refuses to be forgotten. For Maia, the peace she'd built was fragile, balanced delicately between acceptance and distance. It had been nearly a year since she'd walked away, and though the quiet still startled her sometimes, it no longer felt empty. But peace, in families like hers, was never meant to last. It started with a letter, hand-delivered this time, slipped under her apartment door one early morning. She recognized her mother's handwriting instantly, neat and precise, the same looping cursive that had once signed permission slips and grocery lists. The letter was 3 pages long. At first, it seemed almost kind, full of nostalgia and memories. Her mother wrote about Maia's childhood, the way she used to collect seashells at the beach, how she'd always been the strong one. But halfway through, the tone shifted. The flattery softened into guilt. The guilt hardened into accusation. Her mother wrote that the family was falling apart, that Bella was barely holding on, and that her father was under immense stress. She said Maia's choices had shamed them in front of their community, that they couldn't show their faces at church or family gatherings anymore. And then, at the very end, her mother wrote something that made Maia's stomach twist. "You've made your point, but now it's time to come home. We can forgive you, but we need you back." Forgive you. The words echoed like an insult. Maia folded the letter, placed it in the same wooden box where she'd kept her father's message, and closed it without a word. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. A week later, she noticed someone watching the bookstore from across the street. A familiar car, silver and dented, parked for hours. The same car her father drove. He never came inside, never spoke to her, but his presence lingered. Every time she looked up from the counter, she saw him sitting there, staring. Elias, the bookstore owner, eventually noticed too. "You okay?" he asked quietly one afternoon. His voice careful. Maia just nodded, pretending not to care. But inside, she felt the old unease creeping back. The subtle reminder that her family had always known how to make her feel small. That night, she wrote a letter of her own, not to them, but to herself. She wrote about boundaries, about how survival doesn't mean silence, about how love without respect is only control dressed up as care. It was the kind of truth she wished someone had told her years ago. A few days later, her father finally walked into the bookstore. He looked older, his face drawn, his shoulders slumped. Not the proud, confident man she remembered, but someone cracked and uncertain. He didn't shout, he didn't plead. He just stood there, holding his hat in both hands, eyes tired. Maia didn't move from behind a counter. She just waited. He told her they'd lost nearly everything. The savings, the second property, even the retirement account. The financial inquiry she'd filed had triggered audits, and what had once been their safety net had turned into a tangled mess of liabilities. He said he wasn't angry anymore, just disappointed. He said she'd gone too far. Maia listened quietly, letting him speak until the words ran dry. Then, when he finally stopped, she said nothing. She simply turned and walked into the back room, leaving him alone among the shelves. When she returned a few minutes later, he was gone. That night, she expected to feel guilt, but she didn't. What she felt instead was something new, a clean kind of finality. For years, she'd believed family loyalty meant endurance. Now she knew it could also mean letting go. Still, part of her wondered if this was really the end. It wasn't. 2 weeks later, her phone rang again, a number she didn't recognize. When she answered, a voice she hadn't heard in years greeted her. Her cousin, Elena. Elena had always been the quiet observer of the family, the one who saw but never said much. She told Maia that her parents were trying to sell the family home, but that buyers were backing out after rumors circulated about financial trouble and family disputes. She said her mother had been calling everyone in the extended family, begging for sympathy, twisting the story until Maia sounded like the villain who had betrayed them all. Elena didn't believe it. "They're saying you ruined them, but I think they ruined you first." The call left Maia shaken but grateful. It was strange to hear someone else speak her truth out loud, something her family had never allowed. That night, she sat at her desk again, the ocean breeze drifting through her window, and began to write. Not for the internet, not for revenge, but for herself. She wrote every detail of the past 2 years, every manipulation, every sacrifice, every revelation. It wasn't anger anymore. It was record-keeping, preservation, proof that her story mattered. She didn't know it yet, but that journal, those pages, would become something bigger later. Because people weren't just reading her story online anymore, they were asking to share it. Podcasts, article writers, even a small publishing company reached out. Maia ignored them at first, afraid to reopen wounds. But slowly, she began to see it differently. Maybe the best revenge wasn't just walking away. Maybe it was using what nearly broke her to build something new. One evening, she met with a woman named Clara, an editor who had read her viral post months earlier. She told her, gently, that her story could help others, that it wasn't just about betrayal. It was about reclaiming worth after years of invisibility. She thought about it for weeks. Then, one quiet morning, she said yes. She began writing her story properly, carefully, truthfully, painfully. Every memory felt like reopening an old scar. But with each chapter, she felt lighter. She wasn't writing for sympathy or fame. She was writing because she was finally the narrator of her own life. And that's when her mother called one last time. Her voice trembled, but not with anger, but with fear. She said, "They're saying you're publishing a book. Please, Maia, don't do this. You'll destroy us." Maia didn't respond immediately. She looked out her window, the sea stretching endlessly before her, calm and infinite. Then quietly, she said, "No, Mom. I'm just telling the truth." It was the last time they ever spoke.
Stories don't always end with forgiveness. Sometimes they end with understanding. The quiet kind that comes when you finally stop trying to rewrite what's already been lived. That's where Maia found herself a year and a half after she left. The book had come out that spring. It wasn't flashy or scandalous. It was quiet, steady, honest. The title was simple, The Responsible One. It wasn't about revenge. It was about boundaries, family, and the invisible weight carried by those expected to keep everyone else afloat. At first, she hadn't planned to publish under her real name. But one morning, as she read through the final draft, she realized she didn't want to hide anymore. Hiding was what had kept her small, silent, and afraid. So she claimed it. Every word, every page, every wound turned into wisdom. When the book launched, it didn't explode online the way her original post had. It grew slowly, through readers who saw themselves in her, who whispered, "That's my story too." Emails poured in, not from journalists or tabloids, but from people who had lived their own versions of her pain. Each message reminded Maia that what she had done wasn't destruction. It was liberation, not just for her, but for anyone who had ever been silenced by obligation. Her parents, of course, found out. They always did. The day the book went live, her mother called again, not to fight this time, but to cry. She said she'd read the first chapter and couldn't continue. She said she didn't recognize the family Maia had written about. Maia listened, silent. Then she said softly, "That's because you never saw it from my side." Her mother wept, begged her to take it down, to stop airing dirty laundry. But Maia didn't budge. The truth wasn't dirty. It was just uncomfortable. After that, the calls stopped for good. And that was the real ending, not with screaming or reconciliation, but with distance. A silence that wasn't tense anymore, just peaceful. Bella, on the other hand, reached out a few months later. She said she'd read the book too, said it had hurt, but in a good way. She was working full-time now, paying her own bills, saving money. She admitted in a quiet email that she finally understood what Maia had carried all those years. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She just said, "Thank you for showing me what responsibility actually looks like." Maia never wrote back. She didn't need to. Some apologies are complete in their silence. Her life in the coastal town bloomed quietly. The bookstore thrived, and Elias eventually retired, leaving it in her care. She turned it into a cozy space for others like her, people rebuilding after loss, betrayal, or burnout. On weekends, she hosted small readings inviting authors who wrote about healing, self-worth, and resilience. Sometimes she'd catch herself watching the ocean through the big front windows and think about how far she had come, from a daughter expected to be invisible to a woman who had made her invisibility her story, and her story her strength. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she closed the shop early and walked along the beach. The tide was low, the air heavy with salt. She thought about all the versions of herself she had left behind. The obedient daughter, the quiet provider, the woman who had spent her birthdays in other people's shadows. Then she thought about the moment that had started it all. The Facebook post, the shared birthday, and the laptop she never got. She smiled. A soft, private smile. That small act of betrayal had once shattered her. Now it felt almost like a gift. The crack that had finally let her light through. When she got home, she opened her journal, the same one she'd used to write down her story before it became a book. She turned to a fresh page and wrote a single sentence. "Freedom doesn't come from being loved. It comes from being seen." Then she closed it and set it aside. That night, Maia received an email from a young woman she'd never met. The subject line read, "Your story helped me leave." In the body of the email, the woman explained that she'd grown up in a family just like Maia's, one that demanded gratitude for being controlled. Reading Maia's story had given her the courage to walk away. Maia stared at the screen for a long time, tears welling. It hit her then, what she had done wasn't revenge. It was inheritance. She had taken the legacy of silence her family had handed her and rewritten it into something else. A voice. And maybe that was the best kind of revenge. The kind that doesn't destroy. The kind that heals. Weeks later, as her 30th birthday approached, Maia received a card in the mail. It had no return address. Inside was a single message written in careful, familiar handwriting. "I finally understand. I hope one day you can forgive us. Love, Dad." She read it twice, then placed it in the wooden box with the others, her quiet archive of everything that had shaped her. But this time, when she closed the lid, she didn't feel sadness. She felt closure. On the morning of her 30th birthday, Maia awoke before dawn. She made herself coffee, stepped onto her balcony, and watched the first light spill across the ocean.
There were no parties, no shared candles, no expectations. Just her. And for the first time in her life, that was enough. She looked out at the horizon, endless, forgiving, alive, and whispered to herself, not in bitterness, but in gratitude. Happy birthday, Maia. The wind carried her words out to sea, where they disappeared into the rising sun. And just like that, the story that had started with 3 emails ended not in anger, but in peace. The kind of peace that only comes when you stop asking others to see your worth and finally decide to see it yourself. Because sometimes the greatest revenge isn't getting even, it's getting free.